How's everybody doing? Good morning. I'm happy to be with you here this morning. We get to dive into the scriptures together. As you heard from the passage, we're going to be in Acts 16. The title for today's sermon is When the Gospel Breaks Barriers. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like you didn't belong, like you were on the outside looking in? Had someone treat you differently because of your background, your appearance, or limitations? Have you ever witnessed this being done to someone you know? These types of barriers are all around us. Now, I'm a firm believer that God has given each of us unique experiences, good and hard, so that we can share those experiences with each other to see the goodness of God in those. One of those unique ways of how I grew up is I grew up with two older brothers who faced significant challenges. Life growing up brought unique experiences. I saw what it was like to live on the margins of social norms. I remember going to the movie theater, out to eat at a restaurant, and I remember the stares, sometimes whispers. I remember how isolating it could feel. Like there was this invisible barrier between my brothers and the rest of society. It was hard to witness. My oldest brother, Scott, he's unable to do things like speak or hear or read, but it's not a barrier for him. These are some of the things that he shares with our God. He has joy. You put a napkin, you give him a napkin, and he'll just blow it and watch the ripples through the air. You put a coloring book in front of him, and he'll just go to town on that coloring book. So he loves to create. And if he gives you a hug, you're going to be the first one letting go. He is very affectionate. So as I reflect on this idea of the image of God, I'm reminded that it's not primarily about your ability, your outward presentation, these things that society values. It's more about our foundational identity. For Scott, my observance in seeing his life and looking at the scriptures, I see that his life is soaked with the image of God, breaking the boundary society may put around him. And that's exactly what we begin to see in Acts 16. The Spirit keeps pushing Paul beyond one boundary after another, ethnic, geographic, relational, and social. The gospel won't stay boxed in. It crosses every human barrier. So here's our big idea this morning. The gospel brings an upside-down kingdom, breaking through societal barriers and renewing the world through the Spirit, just as Jesus did. Now, before we go into Acts 16, I want to give some introduction and background, and let's remember a little bit of what Paul's been through. So after meeting Jesus on the Damascus Road, his life changed completely, but believers didn't trust him overnight. Can you blame them? I mean, here's a guy who, imagine him coming into this group, right? Oh, so you got a name change and you saw Jesus and now you want us to trust you? Cool story, bro. Like, imagine the mistrust of like, oh, if he's really going to stop this thing, he's going to infiltrate from within and deceive. He had hunted down their friends, but Luke tells us in Acts 9, someone did step up for him. Barnabas. He vouched for him, and they began serving together. But ministry wasn't easy for them. In Antioch, they faced persecution. They were run out of town. In Iconium, people plotted to stone Paul, and in Lystra, they actually did. They stoned him and left him for dead. And even among believers, tension surfaced. You remember a couple weeks ago with Pastor Aaron, a huge debate breaks out. Do Gentiles have to follow Jewish law to belong? Paul said no. Others said yes. So they took it to the Jerusalem at the council. The apostles and elders agreed on two things. Salvation is by grace through faith, not circumcision or law, and the gospel is for all people. But right after that, we have another painful moment that Bruce unpacked last week. Paul and Barnabas sharply disagree over whether to take John Mark, who had abandoned them earlier. Paul says no, Barnabas says yes. Paul's on the perspective of wholehearted commitment, be committed to the mission. Barnabas, however, is talking about loyalty and forgiveness. So they part ways. And how awful was that, church? I mean, think about what these guys have been through. Barnabas was that first person that vouched for Paul. They've been through all of these hard times together. Do you know the bond that creates? So we're meeting a Paul who had already been beaten, rejected, and he was misunderstood from those outside and within the church. But here's the beautiful thing, and where we see God move despite the breakup. The mission didn't stop. If anything, it multiplied. God took a painful split and used it to expand his reach. 2 teams went out instead of 1. And here's the cherry on top. Paul writes later on to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4:11, "Get Mark and bring him with you because he is helpful to me in my ministry." Paul either changed his perspective, saw growth in Mark, or maybe both. Paul even mentions Barnabas positively later on in his letter to the 1 Corinthians. So think about that. How many of us would go out of our way to speak kindly and positively about someone after such a sharp disagreement? Yet, this is what the gospel does. It breaks through the barriers of hurt, sin, and fractured relationships, making reconciliation possible where it once seemed unlikely. So, church, as we reflect on this aspect, strained relationships will happen. It's not if, will. We are a messed up and blessed up family, as Pastor Aaron likes to always share. Yes, our deepest wounds come from relationships, but so does our deepest healing. All right, so as we go into Acts 16, first section I've titled, "The Gospel Moves Us to Lay Down Our Rights." The key idea here is the gospel transcends Jewish expectations and markers of belonging. So we're introduced to Timothy. The scripture says that he's the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. So the makeup of Timothy's parents was already a cultural tension point. His father, Greek father, most likely prevented Timothy from being circumcised. We'll talk about that in a little bit. It was not their custom to do so. On his mother's side, we know her name is Eunice. Well, how do we know that? Well, in 2 Timothy 1:5, Paul calls her out. Eunice and Timothy's grandmother, Lois, had strong faith before him. And we also see later on in that letter that he knew the scriptures from childhood. So what does this tell us? In a time and culture where women were often overlooked, Luke and Paul highlight the crucial role these women played in Timothy's life. It reminds us that some of the most lasting gospel impact often begins quietly at home through faithful, unseen discipleship. And we can see that it lasts for multiple generations. New Testament scholar Craig Keener says this, going back to Timothy's status. He says, Timothy's hybrid status symbolizes the intersection of Jew and Greek so that he embodies in himself the goal of the church's unity. His interethnic and intercultural heritage continues to symbolize the direction that the Spirit is moving God's people. All right, let's talk about this circumcision thing real quick. So why get circumcised? Off the heels of the Jerusalem Council, which we just shared, doesn't matter, right? Doesn't mean that they can be welcomed in. So why? And what about Titus in Galatians 2? Well, in Galatians and the Jerusalem Council, where there was no circumcision, and that wasn't something that was discussed as being welcomed into the family of God, Paul defended the gospel of grace. Circumcision must not become a requirement for salvation or inclusion. In Acts, however, Luke supplies us with a missional strategy rather than a theological one. I love what the NLT says here in verse 3. In deference to the Jews of the area, he arranged for Timothy to be circumcised. And let's look at Paul's mindset. A lot of you are very familiar, 1 Corinthians 9:20. He says, to the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. I think sometimes our tendency is to be quick to win an argument. It's prevalent in our world of social media platforms. You've got debates ad nauseum. You've got titles and videos, X person destroys dumb Y person. And Paul says no. It's not about saying my view isn't dumb, yours is, and here's why. There can be some circumstances for that, but there's always grace, right? This was about humility and respect as to not hinder the message. And then let's talk about Timothy's mindset. This is the guy that actually has to go through with it. It's like, okay, Paul, I understand, but you're going to do this to me, like this pain. So why would Timothy volunteer to do this? Why choose that kind of pain when it wasn't required? Well, it was a sacrificial act of love to remove a barrier and to open doors among the Jewish communities. You saw in the text earlier this morning that the Jewish people knew that he was a Greek. To be able to have a discussion with them and to be like, wait, you got circumcised? You would go through that? Think about the doors that could open in conversation. So Paul and Timothy were saying, we care more about reaching you than holding on to our rights. He met them where they were at and removed a stumbling block. And that challenges me. Am I willing to lay down a preference or a freedom or a comfort so that someone else might hear and be shown the gospel? You know, one of the many things I love about Aletheia is we have all these extensions for local missions. And one of those extensions, if you remember a few weeks back, is For Alliance. And For Alliance, they really come alongside refugees that come to the Tampa area. They come alongside and serve them and share the gospel with them. And one of the ways that we can serve is signing up for what's called friendship families. And so that's what Megan and I did, and we met a nice young couple who had 4 beautiful kids, but their names are Yassine and Noor. And there's a picture that we have which we can show. And so just, this is me over here, and that's Yassine. Yes, we look nothing alike, right? And that's kind of the point here. But I remember Yassine was going through some medical things. So I was trying to learn how to be a social worker with no social worker training because I'm trying to call doctor's offices. I'm trying to figure out translation services. He's got stuff going on. So I'm trying to figure things out. And I remember taking him to an MRI appointment, which was difficult because you can't allow any technology in the MRI room, and I can't be there with him, but they're trying to tell him to stay still because they have to scan. But we got through it, and I remember going home with him. We went to his apartment complex, and I'm already thinking, us Americans, right? We're already on to the next thing, mentally, if not physically. We're go, go, go. So I'm already thinking ahead, and we park, and he says, coffee? And I remember in that moment, I flashed back to the For Alliance training, and I remember them saying, if they give you hospitality, do not refuse it. It's seen as almost offensive. And they're not like us, where it's like planned hospitality. It's in the moment. So I said, you know what? I've got things to do, but I'm going to do this. So I went in, and I remember just their older kids were at school, but they had the baby there. And so I got to talk with them a little bit. Noor made me some coffee. It was very strong. And I remember drinking that because I wanted to be polite, and I'm talking with them. And I'm using Google Translate, and I know 2 words, Yella and Habibi, because my wife did missions in Lebanon, which means hurry, my dear. So what context am I going to use that in? Oh, I know Inshallah. That's 3. I know 3 words. I'm getting up there. But I got to learn about them a little bit more. I got to understand how much they missed family. I mean, imagine going from Syria to Lebanon and then to Tampa, and just all the family that they're missing. But I learned through this process, although I had all those barriers going with me, especially with the language, I learned that love is the universal language. The gospel calls us to lay down our freedoms for the sake of reaching others. Sometimes the way people experience God's love is through our humility. This happens when we let go of those preferences to meet others where they are. When we adopt cultural sensitivity, not to please people, don't get it twisted, but it's to show them that they're seen and valued, removing the societal barriers that the kingdom of God will exploit. And then we move along. The gospel redirects our plans. The Spirit guides the gospel across continents and cultures. So after strengthening the churches he had planted, Paul made a very logical and strategic decision to go deeper into Asia and Bithynia and continue evangelizing. This made total sense, right? It's Paul to a T up to this point. He wasn't chasing any selfish ambition. He was pursuing the mission. Again, this was logical. But then something unexpected happens as we keep reading. And they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And when they had come up to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So what does this tell us? Though Paul's next steps were quite logical, they were also blocked. revealing that God had a different priority in mind. It's interesting that Luke mentions the Spirit of Jesus, if you caught that, did not allow them into Bithynia. And that's pretty significant when you think about it. It means that Jesus is still actively leading the mission. The risen King, seated at the right hand of the Father, is guiding every step through his Spirit. He hasn't stepped off the stage after his ascension. He's directing this entire production. And that truth is still occurring today, church. Now, we're not told exactly why the Spirit blocked Paul from preaching in Asia or going into Bithynia. Luke doesn't give a reason. And maybe that's the point. N.T. Wright says this: "It's one thing to trust God's guidance when it's actually quite obvious what to do next. It's something else entirely when you seem to be going on and on up a blind alley. Sometimes in our lives, God makes it a clear no or not yet. And we don't get the details as to why. Sometimes we're called to just sit in the unknown. One of the simplest prayers I was ever taught was, Lord, I don't know, but you know, and I trust you. However, that aside, let's still pay attention to a couple of possibilities as to why the Lord may have directed Paul in this way, based on the rest of the letter of Acts. First, this was for the good of Paul's future ministry. Paul would later have a powerful, fruitful ministry in places like Corinth and especially Ephesus in Asia, and we'll see that in Acts 19 later on. But that would come after he had engaged more deeply with the Greco-Roman world, where he would obviously need to learn how to engage philosophy, rhetoric, and a different kind of cultural worldview that we'll see in Acts 17 and 18. Second, and I think this is important and often overlooked, God was aiming the gospel like an arrow to the very heart of the power of the day, the Roman Empire, right into the heart of it, to Rome. God's upside-down kingdom, which was built on love and sacrifice, was to reach and infiltrate the Roman Empire, which was built on power, violence, and injustice. For God's kingdom to infiltrate the heartbeat of the empire, Paul needed to go west and not east. So picture Paul for a second, traveling with a brand new team, doors closing all around him, plans falling apart a little bit. Luke doesn't say anything, but you have to imagine it might have felt a little confusing. Maybe it looked like he didn't know what he was doing a little bit. I felt like that. Most of us, we map out our lives. By this age, I'll have this job and this career, this kind of spouse, the perfect spouse, a house in this neighborhood, maybe a couple of kids. Planning can be wise, right? But when we cling too tightly to those plans, we're setting ourselves up for frustration, disappointment, especially when life doesn't follow our script. And that was me with college. When I was 12 years old, my mom surprised me with season tickets to Virginia Tech football. If you're like, who is Virginia Tech football? There's a reason for that. It was 1999, and it was the best year. They went undefeated, went to the national championship, and from there on, they just went downhill. The last 10 years have been painful. But I remember going with my dad. Those long drives, I remember going to see the same people all around us, because when we were in the stadium, you know, you're really close with people, and they had season tickets as well, and we got to build really good friendships with these people. Every year we go and say, hey, how was your summer? How were things? The kids, I grew up, I remember going around campus and seeing the Hokie Stone. I was like, this is where I want to go. But senior year came around, and I was like, I'm going to study sport management. And Virginia Tech did not have that. So I didn't even apply. Like I could get it anyways. My grades were not that good. So I went junior college, and I remember looking at junior college. I remember saying, okay, there's James Madison, which is 90 minutes up the road, versus Tech, which was 30 minutes across the way. And I remember they had the program, sport management. I remember applying, getting in. But I remember just kind of feeling weird. I was way farther from home. I mean, this is a guy who lived in the same zip code for 18 years. And so I go 90 minutes away, and I'm a little homesick. It's not where I was planning to go. I hardly had any friends there. And I used that hurt, and I got sucked into the party scene. And I ended up on academic probation. I messed up my knee really bad playing basketball. And so I was just confused. I was hurt. I didn't know what was going on. And so I went home, got surgery, came back to JMU for my junior year, and I was doing some rehab with a buddy, and we left the gym, and he said, hey, there's this campus organization, Aletheia, and they are at the volleyball courts. and they are handing out free food. And if you want to get a college guy to come to your event, if you say free food, they are there. So I went and got invited out to Aletheia Church in Harrisonburg, and I heard the gospel for the first time. When we experience something in life that doesn't make sense to us, church, it's spiritually healthy to look at that situation but zoom out, to revisit these later on. There will be more of these times, but if you zoom out and see the bigger picture of what God was doing, will help us realize all the more God's sovereignty over our lives and be comforted by that. When life doesn't make sense in the moment, God is still sovereign. That detour that I talked about, that Paul's going through, that may just be the direction. And then in the midst of this waiting and wondering, something remarkable happens. Paul has a vision. It says here in the text, a man of Macedonia was standing there, urging him, saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." Now, dreams and visions were widely accepted as a means of divine guidance in the ancient world. To receive this assurance of divine guidance would offer a crucial encouragement to Paul and team. A little bit about Macedonia. It had belonged to the Roman Empire since 146 BC, and key cities, which we find out later through Acts, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea. The gospel would now enter a thoroughly Roman Gentile space with deep political and cultural ties to the empire, introducing nuances the team, Paul, had not yet encountered. Here's the important part, though. It says later on, immediately we sought, and later on concluded. After the vision, Paul didn't act on his own accord, but shared the details of the vision with his traveling companions. Some form of reflection and discussion probably took place about its meaning. Just as speaking in tongues needed to be interpreted in Pauline churches, so the dream needed to be interpreted together. They reasoned together that the help required in Macedonia would come from preaching the message of Christ to them. So friends, when we sense that God places something on our heart, like he did with Paul, do you trust others to help you discern, or do you carry that alone? Even Paul didn't run solo with his vision. Could have. Not sure how it would have worked out. But he brought it to trusted companions to weigh in and respond together. God's redirection isn't to frustrate us, but to fulfill his greater purpose. Our role is to trust and follow even when the road may look like nothing we planned. And then we move along further in verse 11. God builds the church through the overlooked. The gospel crosses social boundaries, building God's kingdom through unlikely people in unexpected places. So Paul and his team make their way from Troas to Philippi, and this is a leading city of Macedonia and a Roman colony. So, logically, they go where the influence is, right? But what happens next? It flips expectations. When entering a new city, Paul had naturally gone to the synagogue, right? He went to go dialogue and evangelize at these synagogues. With them being in a Roman colony, however, they would quickly learn that no synagogue existed in this city. They did, however, find a quiet prayer gathering led by women meeting outside the city gates near a river. What's interesting is this prayer gathering functions like a synagogue. It meets on the Sabbath for worship and prayer, but it's held outside the city walls, a space in that time marked by marginalization, and is made up of women, some of whom we have to assume were Gentiles drawn to the God of Israel. In a Roman colony, again, built on status, control, power, God starts to build his church in a quiet gathering of women by a river. You see, the world looks to kings, armies, centers of influence to build and grow their kingdoms, and we've seen that throughout history. But God begins his work here, in the midst of gathered women in a prayer by a river, overlooked by society, but central to his story. It reminds me of Paul's words to the Corinthians later on in 1 Corinthians 1:27. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. And the point that Paul is making is that God's ways overturn human expectations of building power and status. It's upside down, if you haven't gotten that theme already. So what does this say to us? If God began his work in Philippi, in a place and among people others might have overlooked, where might we be overlooking the people and places where he wants to work? Maybe it's that quiet coworker you've never thought to engage in a spiritual conversation, or maybe it's a family member you've quietly written off as beyond hope. The daily routines of parenting or caregiving, or a thankless job where your faithfulness feels unseen by anyone. And it's hard, right? We live in a world obsessed with likes and followers and carefully curated images and influence, and it's easy to crave that visibility, that recognition, and applause. But what if those overlooked places are exactly where God is planting something eternal? Are you willing to follow him there, even when no one's watching, and when it looks like nothing meaningful could come from it? And then we meet Lydia, lovely Lydia. In verse 14, it says she's a in verse 14 we meet her, but we have to assume she's a God-fearing Gentile woman, which is interesting. It's not a man like Paul's vision, right? But that's neither here nor there. She was a merchant of fine purple cloth. Why purple? Why call that out, Luke? Well, it was a symbol of wealth and status and even imperial authority. The emperor of Rome often wore purple in the ancient world. As a merchant of fine goods, and the fact that she owns a home large enough to eventually host missionaries without displacing her household, she seemed to be doing well for herself. But again, don't get it twisted. She wasn't part of the wealthy elite. She was comfortable, not powerful. And then look at what the text says. The Lord opened her heart. Opening was used to express the idea of enabling understanding by explanation or supernatural intervention. This is a quiet miracle that launches the church in Philippi. The message came through Paul, but the transformation came from God. It wasn't Paul's skills or persuasion that made the difference. It was the Lord who opened her heart. And yet, don't miss this, God still chose to use Paul through his preaching. Friends, you don't have to change someone's heart, because you can't. So that's settled. But what you can do is you can show up, you can speak, you can be present, and you can trust God to do only what he can do. Then she and her household are baptized, and she urged the missionary team to come to my house and stay. That word urge there in the Greek is parakaleo, which means she exhorted, even pleaded. Now, let's pause. Isn't this a little odd that a woman would invite multiple men that she just met to stay with her? Here's a couple of thoughts on why, though the optics might look questionable, it was wise. First, Lydia's home was ample enough to provide hospitality and would provide the initial base for evangelizing Philippi. And again, this was all out of appreciation for what the Lord had just done for her, extending her home. The other option would be for the team to stay at an inn or hotel. A little bit about that is innkeeping was considered at that time a disgraceful trade. Many people considered them dangerous. Sometimes they were even suspected of murdering guests. And more notoriously, they doubled as brothels. So, what's the choice there? Jesus himself depended on hospitality. So we see the following of Jesus' example. Think of Martha's house, think of Zacchaeus welcoming him in, and he even taught his disciples to do the same. We see this in Luke 9, verse 4. He says, "Whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart." The point here is hospitality is kingdom work. Opening your space or your time, your life, it's one of the most powerful ways the gospel moves into new places. So a couple closing thoughts. Maybe you're here today, and the truth is you feel distant from God. Maybe you think there are barriers between you and him, whether it be your past, your doubts, your failures. But the message of the gospel is this: there are no barriers too great for Jesus. Sin and death have been defeated. He gave his life so you and I could be forgiven, known, and loved. A reflection question I'll lead you with this morning. If barrier breaking is to happen in the Christian life, we have to ask ourselves, what comforts or preferences might God be calling us to lay down so that others can be welcomed into his kingdom? Let's pray. God, thank you for our time together. Thank you for your word. May it continue to enrich our lives, convict us, Help shape us, mold us into the people and children of God you want us to be. Thank you for our identity. And as we enter a time where we remember the sacrifice of Christ, may we come humbly, may we celebrate what you've given to us. Help us to reach others in our lives, especially those or scenes in our lives that may be overlooked. Again, thank you for your word. Thank you for this family. And we thank you for just all that you're doing in our lives. May we see you as more supreme